Morning.
Thank you for being here. Uh, Today we have a webinar on management of patients on ventilator. So we are coming with the second series where we started with the hospital, then we had the case management, and now it is on the patients management of patients on ventilator. We have Dr. Sheila Durai from CMC College of Nursing. She is a professor and a senior nurse manager. So over to Dr. Sheila Durai. She'll explain you today about the ventilator management.
Good morning to all of you. It is such a pleasure to be here in this forum. I thank God for this opportunity. I thank Dr. Dilip Kumar, Dr. Punita Elilarasu, Ms. Bharati, and everyone else at INC who has facilitated this. I would like to thank my Dean, Dr. Vatsala Sadan, and my HOD and Nursing Superintendent, Dr. Pramila Lee, for permitting me to be a part of this webinar and also my institution. Today, we are going to look at critically ill patients who are infected with COVID-19 and who are on mechanical ventilator in the ICU. And during this session, we learn about the specific care of patients with acute respiratory distress syndrome and sepsis, and also learn about the nursing priorities in care of the COVID-19 patient in the ICU. A patient with coronavirus disease, COVID-19, may present with mild, moderate, or severe illness. And the severity of the disease is identified based on the categorization of the clinical features with the guidelines which are given by the Government of India. Now, I'm aware that many of you who have joined the webinar may be students, some of you may be novice, you may not be familiar completely like veteran ICU nurses. So I will try to cover from basics. And if there are any doubts, you're always free to ask questions at the end of the seminar. The most important thing in care of an ICU patient is recognizing the severity of the disease. A patient who is infected with COVID-19, among all these patients, 80% may experience mild or uncomplicated illness. 14% develop severe disease which requires hospitalization and maybe oxygen supply. And there are about 6% who require admission into the intensive care unit. A severe COVID-19 patient may have acute respiratory distress syndrome, sepsis, multi-organ failure, acute kidney injury, or cardiac injury. What is the criteria by which a patient is admitted into the ICU? If the patient requires ventilator support, if the patient requires vasopressors, if the patient's mental status is worsening or the patient is showing features of developing multiple organ dysfunction syndrome, then the patient is fulfilling all the criteria for ICU admission. Poor prognosis can be made out at the time of admission itself by the age of the patient, usually elderly. If a patient is having lymphopenia, high neutrophil lymphocyte ratio, raised lactate dehydrogenase, raised D-dimer or raised ferritin values, then the patient may have a poor prognosis. When we care for patients with COVID-19, we need to remember the principles of management of ARDS, that is acute respiratory distress syndrome. There are 5 principles involved. The first is early recognition. The second is initiation of ventilatory support. The third is treating the underlying cause for ARDS. Then the fourth important role where the nurse plays a very important role, which is monitoring the clinical status of the patient, documenting all the aspects which are monitored, then interpreting the results of the clinical status and responding accordingly. It is very, very important. And then this fourth principle, the nurse plays a very major role. And of course, it goes without saying, delivering quality care to a patient with COVID-19. How do we recognize a patient with ARDS? We start with the history. Anytime we start the nursing care, we start with history, the physical examination, the diagnostic studies, and from that data, we plan the care for the patient. So the nurse needs to look for new or worsening respiratory symptoms within 1 week of known clinical insult. On chest imaging, the patient may have bilateral opacities, which are not fully explained by effusions, lobar or lung collapse, or nodules. And the patient may also have respiratory failure, features of respiratory failure, which are not explained by cardiac failure or fluid overload. So we need to recognize the severity of ARDS. So as a nurse, what is the knowledge that we should have to recognize the severity of ARDS? The first concept that we need to know is PEEP, which is positive end expiratory pressure. This is the pressure required to keep the alveoli open at the end of expiration. And if the patient is on some kind of a support, external airway support, then the patient's PEEP can be monitored. And if the PEEP is more than 5 centimeters or equal to 5 centimeters, once we have established that, then we look at something called the PF ratio. Now, what is the PF ratio? And fraction of inspired FiO2 is fraction of inspired oxygen, which is in atmospheric pressure about 21%. So you calculate the PaO2 of the patient divided by the FiO2 into 100, that will give you the PF ratio. Now, if the PF ratio has to be calculated for a patient who is on some kind of a oxygen support, then we need to know about the percentage of oxygen given through each of the oxygen support devices. For example, if the patient is on nasal cannula and if the patient is on 1 liter of oxygen per minute, then the FiO2 is not atmospheric oxygen, but we are delivering oxygen through the nasal cannula, so it is 24%. If it is 2 liters per minute, it is 28%. It increases by 4% for every liter of oxygen that is provided through the nasal cannula. If the patient is on a face mask, then when you deliver 5 to 6 liters of oxygen, the percentage of oxygen is about 40%. If it is 6 to 7 liters per minute, it is about 50%. And if it is 7 to 8%, it is about 60%. That is the FiO2 when a patient is on face mask. If the patient is on a reservoir bag, then the FiO2 is very easy to calculate. If the patient is on 7 liters per liter, it is 70%. 8 liters per minute, it is 80%. 6 liters per minute, it is 60%. So that is how we calculate the FiO2. Once we are aware of the PaO2 and the FiO2, you calculate the PF ratio. And if the PF ratio is between 200 to 300, you categorize the patient as having mild ARDS. If the patient is having a PF ratio between 100 to 200, the patient is having moderate ARDS. If the patient is having a PF ratio below 100, then the patient is in severe ARDS. In areas where you do not have an ABG analysis machine, you only have the oxygen saturation that is available, then you already know the FiO2 based on the oxygen supply that you are giving for the patient. Then take the SiO2, use the same formula, SpO2 divided by FiO2 into 100, that will give you the saturation and oxygenation ratio. If the saturation oxygenation ratio is less than 315, that means the patient is having acute respiratory distress syndrome. This is true even in patients who are not having any oxygen support, who are not on any ventilation. Once we have recognized the severity of acute respiratory distress start off with the simple face mask or nasal cannula or reservoir based on the findings that we have already seen, whether if it is mild ARDS or moderate ARDS. You start off with a face mask or a nasal cannula and see the progress of the patient. Within an hour, if the patient is not able to meet the goal of oxygenation, which is saturation of about 94%, then we need to go in for high flow oxygen systems. There are two high flow oxygen systems that we can think of. One is the high flow nasal cannula. We refer to it as the HFNC or the HFNO. And then we have the non-invasive ventilation, which we refer to as NIV. Now, this high flow oxygen system is provided to patients who are awake, who are cooperative, who will cooperate with the management with a non-invasive ventilator, who will obey commands, those who have normal hemodynamics and they don't have any urgent need for intubation because their partial pressure of carbon dioxide is less than 45 mm of Hg. Now, this high flow oxygen system is quite safe compared, that is the HFNC is quite safe compared to non-invasive ventilation. In the high flow nasal cannula, you can provide a high flow, even up to 60 liters per minute, and you provide heated, humidified air to the patient. The temperature of the air can be increased up to 37 degrees centigrade, and oxygen flow can be given to the patient comfortably without worrying about the patient's safety. This may be associated with less mortality. When you start the patient on HFNC, you need to monitor the patient. And within 1 hour, if the patient's saturation target is not met, then high flow is unsuccessful in this patient and intubation should not be delayed. While the patient is on HFNC, it is very important for us to make sure that airborne precautions are met, because this is one procedure, one oxygenation delivery procedure where there is aerosol generation, and the lowest flow possible has to be given to maintain oxygenation if the patient is doing well with HFNC. The next option is non-invasive ventilation. Before that, we need to recognize the contraindications for HFNC if the patient is having hypercapnia. We can assess hypercapnia by doing end-tidal carbon dioxide. We call it as EtCO2. And if the value is above 45 mm of Hg, then the patient may not benefit with hypercapnia. That is usually because of exacerbation of obstructive lung disease or cardiogenic pulmonary edema. If the patient is having hemodynamic instability or multi-organ failure or an abnormal mental status, this may not be the mode of treatment because the patient will need invasive ventilation. The next mode of oxygenation is through non-invasive ventilation, which is provided in two ways. One is continuous positive airway pressure. We refer to it as CPAP, or the bilevel positive airway pressure, which is referred to as the BiPAP. Both of these are delivered through a tight fitting mask, and here again the patient has to be awake, has to be cooperative, and should not have a sense of claustrophobia. Then only this can be successful. This is usually not recommended for patients with ARDS because it may preclude low tidal volumes and adequate PEEP levels. If it is given, then we need to follow airborne precautions. Here also we have contraindications. We have to ensure that NIV, if given, it has to be administered in a safe way because there is an increased risk to healthcare worker because of the aerosol generation. There is increased failure rate in non-cardiogenic etiology patients. Usually patients who have cardiogenic problems are preferred to be given non-invasive ventilation. And another problem is large tidal volume. Because of the tight-fitting mask, the patient can also develop facial skin breakdown. When the patient is on NIV, we have to really goal, then without any delay, we may have to put the patient on invasive ventilation. Here, the contraindications for non-invasive ventilation is hemodynamic instability, multi-organ failure, and abnormal mental status. Once we have started an oxygenation for the patient and we start monitoring the patient, documenting and interpreting, we need to look for any signs of respiratory failure. How do we recognize respiratory failure? If there is a rapid progression of the respiratory distress that the patient is having, and if the saturation drops below 90%, the moment it starts falling below 94%, we need to be careful to monitor the patient very closely, and we should not leave the patient bedside. And if it drops below 90%, we need to take measures immediately to inform the intensivist for invasive ventilation. If there is persistent progression of hypoxemia despite oxygen therapy, even after giving oxygen therapy, patient continues to have hypoxemia. That is, the partial pressure of oxygen continues to drop, and if it is below 60 mm of Hg, patient needs further intervention. And if the saturation and oxygenation ratio is less than 300, while the patient is on about 10 liters of oxygen therapy and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is less than 45 mm of Hg, this is an indication for ventilatory support, that is invasive ventilatory support. When you have made the decision for ventilatory support, it has to be a teamwork between the intensivist, the nurse, and the technician. The first and foremost important thing that is to be done is to inform the patient and the family. The patient, if the patient is awake, give the patient some information on what is going to be done and how the patient can cooperate. If the patient is not in that state, be the family who will have to give the concern, and we'll have to inform the family. Prepare for intubation with video laryngoscope. This is a recommendation given by all the guideline forming committees, the CDC, WHO, and all of that. This is because there may be difficult airway because of the characteristic features of ARDS in this patient and the airway. So any kind of delay leads to increased aerosol generation, which is a harm to the medical personnel, as well as a delay for the patient receiving oxygenation. The moment you stop giving oxygen to the patient, you will find the SpO2 dropping. So the interventions have to be done very quickly. So there should be an experienced airway management team available, and they say the most experienced intensivists should be allotted for the intubation procedure, and during the procedure ensure airborne precautions are taken. The patient has to be pre-oxygenated with 100% oxygen for 5 minutes. Usually we follow 2 minutes or 3 minutes, but here in this patient, because of the severe ARDS, we have to ensure at least for 5 minutes the patient is on 100% FiO2, and we do not encourage ambu bag mask ventilation again because of the airborne problem. Once the ventilatory support has been decided upon, a rapid sequence induction checklist can be followed, which differs from intensivist to intensivist or anesthetist to anesthetist or from unit to unit. Main role of the nurse is anticipation and preparation and getting the equipment ready. And when nurse practitioners are given the privilege of intubation, they need to be thoroughly prepared in terms of intubating the patient safely, because the patient can desaturate once the oxygen is removed. Monitor and respond to any kind of hemodynamic instability. Look at the heart rate, look at the BP, look at the respiratory rate, and see if there are any changes at that time. And the induction anesthetics may need to be properly titrated. This again depends on the protocol which are followed in different units. You may use fentanyl, or you may use MIDA, ampulas or ketamine or scopolamine, whatever is the drug which is used, it needs to be used according to the protocol. And some of the units, they keep ephedrine ready in case the patient hypotenses during the intubation procedure. Important thing to remember is that we have to pre-oxygenate with 100% oxygen for 5 minutes. Now, invasive ventilation can be done through the endotracheal tube, the nasotracheal tube, the laryngeal mask, or the tracheostomy. And the most common one for the patient with COVID is the endotracheal tube. Patient may require sedation. You need to have adequate equipment, and trained staff should be present when invasive ventilation is done. The strategy which is followed in invasive ventilation is lung protective ventilation. Why lung protective ventilation? Because this is a heterogeneous lung. The ARDS lung, we call it as a heterogeneous lung. Why do we call it as a heterogeneous lung? Because the different alveoli are in different states. Some of the alveoli are normal, some of the alveoli are collapsed, some of the alveoli are distended, some of the alveoli are fluid filled. And that is why COVID-19 ARDS patient is said to have a heterogeneous lung. Now, a lung like this with alveoli in different states like this is very much prone for injury. Whatever the settings you do on the ventilator, whatever you provide as ventilator setting, it has to be very safe to prevent the following problems. Patient can have ventilator-induced lung injury, patient can have barotrauma because of increased pressure, patient can have volume trauma because of increased volume. It is important for us to know two main concepts here. One is stress and the other is strain. What is stress? Stress is the pressure that is given to increase the volume. The pressure that is given to increase the volume. And strain is the change in the physiology of the alveoli because of the stress that is placed on it. So when there is excessive strain, the patient can have volume trauma, and the patient can have atonic trauma because of the collapse of the alveoli. The patient can have biotrauma. This is mainly because of the COVID-19 infection. There is an influx of the viruses within the lungs and inside the alveoli, and there is also a cytokine storm which is affecting the lungs, and both of this together can affect the alveoli, causing biotrauma of the alveoli. And the patient can also have oxygen toxicity because of the high levels of oxygen which can be provided during this time. What are the ventilator settings with which we can make sure that the patient receives lung protective ventilation? The tidal volume. The first is the tidal volume, we refer to as the TV. The recommendation is between 4 to 8 ml per kg predicted body weight. And the inspiratory pressure, the lowest pressure is best, and the plateau pressure of about less than 30 centimeters of water. What is plateau pressure? The pressure that is essential to maintain the lung inflation while without any airflow. While at rest or without any airflow, what is the pressure that is required to maintain lung distension? That is plateau pressure. So we need to keep that pressure at less than 30 centimeters. Usually it is about 20 centimeters. The target for lung protective ventilation is 88 to 94% because it ensures decreased mortality in patients with ARDS. Always set the respiratory rate to approximate the minute ventilation. What is minute ventilation? It is the amount of volume of air during inhalation and exhalation. So it is calculated by the tidal volume into respiratory rate. So the normal minute ventilation is about 6 liters per minute. So if you have the tidal volume at 500 ml into, let's say, 12 breaths, then that would equal to a minute ventilation of 6 liters per minute. And always set the inspiratory expiratory ratio so that the inspiration time is less than the expiration. This requires a higher flow rate. How do we determine the flow rate? When you set at volume ventilation, and you keep the flow at 500 ml, and let's say the time is 1 second. Time is 1 second, and the volume, the flow is 500 ml. So flow automatically becomes 500 ml per second. Volume is 500 ml, time is 1 second, so the flow is 500 ml per second. And if you calculate the liters per minute, you will get it as 30 liters per minute. That is how we calculate the flow. So that can be the lung protective ventilation. When a patient is on this lung protective ventilation, we need to monitor the patient very judiciously. The saturation of oxygen is to be monitored continuously, and we need to monitor the pH, the PaO2, the PaCO2, and this should be available in all ICU. And if it is not available, we can only go by the SpO2 value. And when a patient is on ventilator, definitely the ABG has to be done to monitor and titrate accordingly. The ventilator parameters will also have to be checked and monitored regularly, especially the plateau pressure and the compliance. It needs to be checked every 4 hours or after any change in the PEEP or any change in the tidal volume. An intrinsic PEEP and inspiratory-expiratory ratio have to be changed after any change in the respiratory rate. And if there are any changes in the ABG, usually the rate of respiration and the depth of respiration, that is the volume, is changed. And at that time also we need to check or monitor the ventilatory parameters. And if there is any asynchrony that is noticed, we have to monitor the waveforms. When a patient is on high PEEP, usually the recommended PEEP for a patient who is having severe ARDS is about 15 to 20 centimeters of water, but for safe lung protective ventilation, they give 10 to 15 centimeters of water. When a patient is on high PEEP, the patient can have hypotension because there is decreased venous return to the right heart. The patient can also have over-distension of the normal alveoli, and because of which the patient can have ventilator-induced lung injury. And this actually leads to less gas exchange. Because of that, there is increase in the dead space. Whenever there is more space where the gas exchange is not happening, we call that as dead space. So we need to titrate the FiO2 to the lowest level to make sure that the SpO2 is 88 to 93%. If we increase the FiO2 or keep on increasing the FiO2, we know that the patient can go into oxygen toxicity. So one of the main goals is to come down on the FiO2 levels as soon as possible, ensuring that the patient is able to maintain the oxygen saturation. When a patient is having severe ARDS, they may not be able to manage only with lung protective ventilation, especially if the immune system of the patient is reacting very strongly. In addition to the cytokines and the viruses, the immune modulating substances within the body are targeting the lungs and affecting the lungs. Just the lung protective strategy alone will not be able to help a patient, especially if the patient is having refractory hypoxemia. When do we say the patient is having refractory hypoxemia? When there is low oxygen tension and patient is, in spite of lowered oxygen tension, patient is not able to maintain the SpO2. If the patient is having severe acidosis and patient is unable to achieve the LPV target, recognize these patients early, and if the PF ratio continues to be below 100 mm of Hg, the patient needs interventions, further interventions quickly. So what is the recommended interventions that are given by the guideline committees? If it is mild or moderate ARDS, patient is treated with lung protective ventilation along with fluid restriction. And if it is severe ARDS, start off with lung protective ventilation, then fluid restriction and prone position, which is going to help the patient. If this is not going to help the patient may need higher PEEP. As I told you, can recommend up to 15 to 20 centimeters of water as higher PEEP, and they may have to use a maneuver called recruitment. What is recruitment? It is trying to ensure that a high pressure is given to keep the alveoli open, and after which give adequate pressure to ensure that the alveoli is kept. Recruitment is trying to get as much alveoli to be involved in gas exchange as possible. There are different techniques for that, and the guidelines for each of that is given. Oxygenation and guidelines for that also is given. Now, there are many complications that these patients can develop when they are on ventilators. One is asynchrony, where the patient and the ventilator are not in sync, or there could be auto PEEP. The patient does not expire full tidal volume. The air becomes trapped, and this can cause alveolar damage. And another one is barotrauma, trauma due to the pressure. This is damage to the alveoli because of the heterogeneous lung. There are some alveoli which can be affected, though you're trying to give lung protective ventilation. And another common problem, if a patient is on a ventilation for more than 5 days, usually the patient becomes dependent on the ventilator. The respiratory muscles get deconditioned, and it is necessary for us to train the patients to start breathing on their own. So that is one complication, and another complication is ventilator associated pneumonia. Complications with other systems, the patient could have hemodynamic compromise, and a patient on ventilator, imagine the patient on a tube from the nose or a tube from the mouth, a tube from lines all over, maybe a central line, peripheral line, arterial line, urinary catheter, and the legs may be in a sequential compression device, the arms, the patient is having lines. Just imagine a patient like that. It's very, very difficult for them. Maybe they were not awake when they were intubated and put on the machine, and once they wake up, the patient will be very, very, very anxious. So they can have stress because of the critical illness itself, all the metabolic processes related to the illness itself, and also because of their psychological status. And there can be sleep deprivation. I don't need to tell you about that. The alarms, the medical personnel, and the other patients, all of these, the patient can have sleep deprivation. Very, very crucial to address this in a patient with COVID-19, because their problem will not only be related to their physical status, but to their emotional status, their social status, about their family, and so on. These patients can also develop ulcers, and they can develop gastritis. Why do these patients commonly develop gastritis? It is because there is a good blood supply to the stomach, which helps in production of mucus, and that mucus is protective against the hydrochloric acid. When a patient becomes critically ill, the blood supply is directed to the vital organs and decreased to the stomach or to the GI organs, and the mucus production is decreased, because of which they are more prone to develop gastritis, they are more prone to develop ulcers, and they can also develop malnutrition because their requirements are not met. They can also have increased intrathoracic pressure because of the mechanical ventilation. There can be changes in the cardiac output, there can be decreased venous return, and that can lead to a lot of systemic problems, and they can have edema due to decreased venous return. What can we do as nurses to prevent ventilator-associated pneumonia? One preference given by the guidelines is oral intubation, and avoid disconnecting the patient from ventilator. When you disconnect the patient from ventilator, the patient will have loss of PEEP and atelectasis. So it is good to have an inline catheter that's a piece. Once the patient is ventilated, be very careful in looking at the circuits or changing the circuits. It is not changed routinely. It is changed only if it is soiled or damaged, and a circuit which is used for a patient is discarded following all the COVID-19 waste management protocols, and a new ventilator circuit is used for every patient, and periodically any kind of condensate is to be drained and discarded, and only closed suction system is encouraged, and the routine exchange of ETT is not encouraged in patients with COVID-19. The nursing care, which can have a great role in preventing ventilator-associated pneumonia, is the removal of plaque from the oral cavity. Plaque evidence has shown that the presence of plaque is the main reason for ventilator-associated pneumonia. This plaque can get into the throat and get into the pharynx and get into the trachea, the bronchi and alveoli, and the plaque, the microorganisms from the plaque are the ones which can cause ventilator associated pneumonia. So we need to, the evidence-based practice says follow brushing to remove the plaque, flush well with normal saline to remove all of that, and then coat with chlorhexidine to prevent formation of plaque. This is one area where I did not find much of literature at all. Even when all the guidelines are talking about aerosol generation activities, nobody is talking about the oral care or the oral aspiration, oral suctioning that is done by nurses, which is the highest aerosol generating activity. So we need to make modifications wherein when there is a COVID-19 patient who is having high aerosol generation possible, we need to ensure that the nurse is well protected and activities where aspiration is done from the oral cavity is minimized only when needed, and chlorhexidine mouthwash can be done appropriately. Change heat moisture exchanger when it is only malfunction, soiled or wet, and regular routine change is not acceptable, and specialized endotracheal tubes with subglottic suction can be done. When subglottic suction is done, we need to ensure that appropriate negative pressure, that is only 30 mm of Hg, is used in doing subglottic suctioning, and daily coordinated spontaneous breathing trial can be done to wean the patient away from the ventilator. Now we have looked at the respiratory problem and how to manage the respiratory ARDS problem of the patient. Now let's look at how a nurse can recognize septic shock. When a patient is having persisting hypotension despite volume resuscitation, then the patient is going into septic shock. The main indicator is the mean arterial pressure. Okay, that we call it as MAP. We get the mean arterial pressure by calculating systemic pressure plus diastolic into 2 and divided the entire value divided by 3, and the normal is about 93 mm of Hg. If the patient is not able to maintain a MAP above 65 mm of Hg, and if the serum lactate level is less than 2 millimole per liter, then the patient is going into septic shock, and you can also see deteriorating clinical signs of perfusion. What does the nurse check for when she's looking for the signs of perfusion? Capillary refill. Capillary refill is one important check which the nurse has to do every 30 minutes. It gives accurately the perfusion status of the patient, the color of the extremity, the temperature of the extremity, the distal pulse of the patient, and that will tell whether the perfusion is good or not good, and the nurse needs to monitor that and document that. It's good for us to recognize the physiological pathway in sepsis, and with that we will be able to know how exactly to monitor or what exactly to monitor in this patient. These patients, because the COVID-19 patients, because of the cytokine storm, they will have vasodilation, which in turn will lead to hypotension, and there will be a capillary leak, and that is because of the immune modulating substances and also because of edema. And the patient will also have inflammation, which will lead to capillary leak, edema, and ARDS. There will be activation of the endothelium, and that will lead on to coagulation cascade and volume depletion. And because of the pathological coagulation, the patient will have microcirculatory clots, tissue hypoperfusion, and organ failure, almost similar to other patients with sepsis. Mainly here, the insult is because of the cytokine storm that the patient will have. So what are the nursing care priorities in care of a patient with COVID-19? It is sometimes student nurses and nurses who are new to the ICU find it difficult to remember all the complex clinical features and the care aspects related to patient. It is easy to remember if we can start off and categorize or compartmentalize the care of the patient in our mind, starting priority wise: the respiratory system, the circulatory system, the renal system, the neurological system, the psychosocial, spiritual system of the patient, the endocrine, GI, the musculoskeletal, integumentary system. Once you have that priority wise, then for each system, you can look at the history related to the respiratory system, the physical manifestations in the respiratory system, the diagnostic or investigation results of the respiratory system. That makes it very easy to comprehensively look at everything and not miss out anything in care of a critically ill patient. Let's start with the respiratory nursing care. As I told you, these patients will be on prone position, and the protocol which is recommended is a prone positioning of about 12 to 16 hours. So we can start off by proning for about 2 hours and see the tolerance of the patient, then increase to 6 hours, and then to 8 hours, and then to 12, and then to 16, and that is the recommended prone position. This prone position helps the patient. It helps in recruiting the alveoli. It helps in good oxygenation. There's a lot of change that can be seen in the patient once the patient is put on prone position. But this prone position has a lot of complications. So we need to assess the patient and we need to care for the patient before the proning position. We need to assess all the aspects, the skin of the patient, the hemodynamic status of the patient, and we need to have adequate pressure relieving devices to safeguard the patient at the time of proning. And this prone position has to be done with adequate help. I know of friends who proning, each of them take up a specific position and they prone the patient. Now, these patients can develop complications. One is transient hemodynamic instability. So as soon as the proning is finished, we need to assess the patient, assess the respiratory status, assess the tubes and the lines, look at the vitals of the patient, look at the hemodynamic status of the patient, and ensure that the patient's arms are placed well. During prone position, they keep one arm on top, which is called the swimming position, and turn the head to one side. And after 2 hours, the next arm is kept on top and the head is turned to the opposite side. This is done to make sure that the patient does not develop brachial plexus injury. Patient can also develop pressure because of the medical devices. Some of the ECG line or the tubings may be underneath the skin of the patient, which can cause skin injury. And the most common problem that you will find among these patients is periorbital edema, facial edema, swollen lips, swollen tongues, and they can have lines and tubes displacement, and they can have aspiration if they are on NG feed or nasogastric feed or nasoduodenal feed. And it is very important to assess the patient before the proning, during the time of proning, and after the proning. Systematic check from head to toe is to be done before the other aspects of care can be started. if the patient is awake, the patient can be encouraged to do self-prone, and care scheduling needs to be done when the patient is on semi-recumbent position. So nurses can use innovations in how this can be done successfully. Usually what they do is prone the patient during the night. My friend from Ireland told me they prone the patient in the night, and throughout the night the patient is on prone position. Morning they put the patient on semi-recumbent position so that they're able to give all the care, all the line and tube care, everything can be done, and care scheduling can be done when the patient is on semi-recumbent position. The skin care has to be given very judicially every hour. The bony prominences have to be lifted and massaged with liquid paraffin or oil, which will prevent skin breakdown. And swollen lips care have to be done. Different interventions can be brought out by nurses who are taking care of this patients, and ice can be used for inflammation. If the patient is on feeding, careful, cautious feeding is to be done when the patient is on prone position. The aerosol generating activities are to be decreased when a patient is on prone position. So multi-dose inhalers are preferred over nebulization. Heat moisture exchangers are preferred for humidification instead of the liquid humidifiers, and closed endotracheal suction is preferred. Normal saline should not be instilled for suctioning, and avoid brushing and flushing during oral care in these patients alone because of the aerosol generating activity. Do cautious oral suctioning and avoid suctioning during extubation. What is the nursing care pertaining to the hemodynamic status? Assess the fluid status of the patient, assess the skin temperature, look at the inotrope balance if the patient is on fluids and inotropes, check for signs of decreased cardiac output and edema, and ensure the perfusion targets are met. What are these perfusion targets? The mean arterial pressure above 65 mm of Hg, urine output about 0.5 ml per kg per hour, more than that, and the capillary refill should be less than 3 seconds, and this capillary refill should be checked every 30 minutes for a patient with COVID. This is a simple, it's not a very costly this one. It can be easily done by the nurse. We just need to take the time to do it every 30 minutes, and then the level of consciousness will also give us an idea about the patient's perfusion status. Passive leg raising test can be done when you have the provision to check the cardiac output. When they raise the legs for about 45 degrees, they will be able to check the cardiac output. That will give us a idea about the hemodynamic status. What is the fluid intervention? Usually 30 ml per kg of isotonic crystalloid is given during the first 3 hours the patient comes into ICU. There is a conservative fluid strategy where many intensivists do not want to overload the patient, mainly because of the heterogeneous ARDS lung. So 250 to 500 ml crystalloid bolus is usually given in 15 to 30 minutes, and after the fluid resuscitation is done, only then the inotropes are started, and noradrenaline is given as the first line or first vasoactive drug of choice. And positive balance is to be prevented, and all hypotonic crystalloids, starches, gels, all of those are discouraged for a patient with COVID-19. And dobutamine is another inotrope which is given to improve the perfusion. In terms of nursing care of a patient related to the hemodynamic status, the nurse's role, important role, is in preventing the central line associated bloodstream infection and prevent deep vein thrombosis. Because of the decreased venous return, there is pooling of blood, and the patient can develop clots, and the patient can develop complications because of thromboemboli. So there are many interventions which a nurse can do. One is the thromboemboli deterrent stockings, which will help in prevention of this. Active and passive exercises can be done depending on the cooperation of the patient. Low molecular weight heparin is usually prescribed, and a sequential or pneumatic compression device is a must for a patient who is in sepsis to improve the venous return. Recently, there are a lot of articles about plasmapheresis for this patient. So in a COVID-19 patient, how does plasmapheresis help? It removes the inflammatory cytokines, it stabilizes the endothelial membranes, and it resets the hypercoagulable state. And that is one reason why plasmapheresis is an option for patients in COVID-19. And these patients also have increased protein and red blood cells in urine, and 15% of patients with COVID-19 who are in the ICU may develop acute kidney injury, and these patients will be started on dialysis, and the care pertaining to dialysis has to be followed for these patients. Going on to the immunological status of the patient, as we have seen in earlier webinars, the patient may be given antimicrobial therapy after ensuring the QTC interval, which is hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin. And if the patient is in refractory shock, only if the patient is in refractory shock, they may even give hydrocortisone. Once we know that a patient is COVID positive inside the ICU, the nurse is responsible for the care of the patient and responsible for self-protection, and the nurse managers and charge nurses are responsible for the protection of all the nurses. So if the patient is in ICU, we consider the risk because the nurses are involved in aerosol generating activities which are performed over there. Going on to the neurological nursing care, the neuromuscular blocking may be needed for patients at least for 48 hours, which will help the patients to adjust with the mechanical ventilation, and they may not be able to be in the prone position without some kind of a sedation. And if they have persistent high plateau pressure, or if they are having ventilated dysynchrony, they may need sedation, and we'll have to minimize the sedation or give intermittent sedation based on the patient's status. And the patient may be having fever, and we need to address the temperature and give routine temperature care for these patients. The psychosocial status and the spiritual care of the patient is the most important. This patient is isolated, alone, and by self inside the ICU, and this patient may be in distress, may not be able to express because of the tube. So you need, as a nurse, when you approach the patient, you need to smile, you need to be calm, and you need to communicate. I would say communication is the basis by which we can ensure these patients are able to cope with the sickness that they have, cope with the mechanical ventilation, cope with the isolation, cope with all the lines and tubes, cope with all the physiological effects of the COVID-19. We can, once they are awake, they are cooperative, we can also get some kind of a device, a tab or a mobile, etc. For protection, for isolation precaution, we can put it inside a plastic cover and cover it, and that can be cleaned with 1% Dakins that can be given, through which they can communicate with their loved ones, and they say that makes a huge difference. There are hospitals in the States or in the Ireland where the nursing students take up this role and go to each patient. They are assigned, they make sure that the communication part is completely taken care of. As usual, the patients may have pain, agitation, or they may become delirious depending on their physiological status, and that has to be addressed along with sleep and rest. A patient who is critically ill, the entire metabolic process is changed, and their calorie requirement and protein requirement differs, and they are prone for stress ulcers and gastrointestinal bleeding. And evidence has shown that early enteral nutrition is the best method of preventing all complications related to the GI system. So patient can be started on enteral nutrition. If possible, then H2 receptor antagonists or proton pump inhibitors can be given. And we will have to, as nurses, we will have to remember, once the patient starts having orally, patient may have anosmia. They are not able to have good smell. So we will have to remember that when we start off the nutrition for that patient. Patient will have high need for protein, vitamins, that has to be met. Any issues related to nausea, loose stools will have to be dealt with on an individual basis. Remember, all GI secretions are potentially hazardous. There are papers which have come up saying that the virus is present in the stools. So we need to be cautious when doing NG aspiration and disposal. Safe handling of stools, stoma output, etc. have to be taken care of. A patient who becomes critically ill usually has a problem in terms of glycemic control. Even non-diabetic patients, when they become critically ill, because of the metabolic process which goes on, they may have hyperglycemia. If there is a diabetic patient who develops COVID-19, there has to be very cautious dealing of this patient, very close monitoring has to be done. And they say mortality due to diabetes is about 7.3% in these patients. So every institution, every unit has a different insulin administration protocol or algorithm which can be given. A critically ill patient's calorie requirement is about 30 to 35 kilocalories per kg body weight, and that will have to be titrated along with the insulin, and patient need about 2 to 3 grams of protein compared to the 1 gram of protein that we all need. We need to take extra caution in patients with diabetes and sepsis. Mobility is one important thing which will help everything inside the body. When a patient is ambulated, when the patient is mobilized, there is increased venous return, there is increased cardiac output, because of which there is increased perfusion. All the cells are able to get the blood, and so there are a lot of improvements which happen in a patient who is mobilized, who is ambulated. Depending on the status of the patient, once the patient is out of the critical, very critical stage, the patient can be mobilized, we can ambulate the patient. This will help in decreasing ICU related weakness, and this requires teamwork. We need turning teams for proning the patient, and we also need to be very, very careful in ensuring safety, especially related to aerosol generating. The patient can just cough out when you're ambulating the patient. So put the patient on a mask. If the patient is not on any oxygen device, put the patient on a mask before you do ambulation or mobilization, and take care of all the tubes, lines and catheters, and give, whenever care is given, whenever hygienic care is being met, the active and passive limb exercises can be done, which will help the patient in increasing the venous return. And how's the ICU to be prepared? It all depends on the facility that is available in each individual ICU. Every institution has different facility, and as nurses, we can know what is the ideal, but we may not, it may not be possible for us to function in an ideal ICU. Whatever is available, within that we need to have knowledge. Is there a separate air handling unit? Is there a COVID designated area? Is there a designated donning area, designated doffing area, N95 respirators? Do we have all the cleaning protocols in place? Do we have the HEPA filters? Do we have negative pressure rooms? Look at all of that. Based on what you have, you will have to change your method. So we have to improvise with whatever is available. With that, we'll have to improvise and provide safe nursing care to patient. In care of a critically ill patient, it is very, very important for us to have safe care of the nurses. Reminder for all the nurses, there are aerosol generating activities for which the nurse has to protect ourselves, which is flushing or brushing during oral care, oral suctioning, humidification, nebulization, suctioning, and brushing teeth, proning. Even during proning, the secretions can come out from the oral cavity or from the nasal cavity. Then during ET intubation, during manual ventilation, if they are doing a bronchoscopy, tracheostomy, and if the patient is having cardiopulmonary resuscitation, there can be aerosol generation, and during all these activities, the nurse has to protect herself with the full complement of personal protective equipment. And prioritize the care of the patient based on what status the patient is. If the patient is complaining of pain, we prioritize that, and looking at the clinical status of the patient with everything that is there, modulate the care of the patient accordingly. Thank you all so much.
Your mic is off.
Madam Bharti, your mic is off.
Dr. Sheila,
Yes.
during summary, it was muted. Can you repeat the summary again for the benefit of the participants?
Yes, it is, though the care of a critically ill patient is very complex, and there are various aspects that a nurse has to remember. So the nurse can compartmentalize the care in her mind to make sure that she does not miss out any aspect of care. Another important thing that the nurse has to remember is prioritization of the care of the patient according to the need of the patient, according to the problem that the patient is having at that particular time or during that particular shift. And protection of the patient from further infection and self-protection from infection are two important roles of the nurse while taking care of a patient, a critically ill patient, COVID-19 patient in the ICU. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. I think it was a very good topic, but it was too much. I mean, for the students level, I think we need to have one more session. So I think at the student level, because there were a lot of questions, very, very simple questions, they're going on asking the questions. So I think we may have to have one more session on it for the students itself. So thank you for the participants. There are so overwhelming questions and so many participants today. So we're very glad because this is for yourself and not for us. So we are very, very glad to have you on our as a participants, as an attendees. So we have question and answers. I will take the question and answers now.
Yes, yes, please.
Yeah, the first question comes, what is lymphopenia?
Okay, so can I answer that? Yes. Okay. So lymphopenia is when there is when there's a change in the lymphocyte level of the patient. Normally, the patient needs to have about 20 to 40% of lymphocytes, and when you take in terms of count, it's about 1,000 to 4,000 per ml. And when there is a change, we call that as lymphopenia. And the NLR rate, that is the neutrophil lymphocyte ratio that the patient is to have. Usually the neutrophil lymphocyte ratio is about 1:3. In COVID-19 patients, sometimes it will go up to 9 and it may even go up to 100, they say.
And then the next question comes, what is PF ratio?
Okay, so PF ratio is calculated by the pressure of partial oxygen divided by the fraction of inspired oxygen, that multiplied by 100. That will give you the PF ratio. For example, the normal PaO2 partial pressure of oxygen, we refer to it as PaO2. So the normal PaO2 ranges from 80 to 100. So let's say my PaO2 is 80 mm of Hg, and I am taking atmospheric oxygen. So the atmospheric oxygen is 21%. Let's say because of all the pollution, we have 20%. So 80 by 20, okay? 80 by 20, we get 4. That multiplied by 100, we get 400. So the PF ratio is 400 for normal adults. And if we have a PaO2 of 100, then it is 500. So 100 by 20 into 100 will give you 500. So into 100, that is the PF ratio.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. And now the next question is, what is ARDS?
Acute respiratory distress syndrome. That is ARDS.
So the students have not gone through your PPT properly. That shows that. I will listen to you. And now next question is, please can you explain COVID-19 replication?
COVID-19?
Replication. It's a replicator among the, why it is replicated? COVID-19 replication.
Okay, this is a scientific question, but I'll try my best with the knowledge that I have. If you look at the coronavirus, the core of the virus, there is actually DNA material which is present, which is covered by endothelium, or it is covered by an endothelium, and they has got spikes on that. And these spikes are the ones which enable the virus to get into the cell of a human being, and through these spikes they enter the human being. Because they enter through the cell, the endothelium of the cell covers the coronavirus, and because of which the cell recognizes it as its own. And there is an entire genetic process, replication process, which goes on just like a normal multiplication, and because of which there is replication of the virus inside the human body.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. How do we calculate FiO2?
Okay, so FiO2 is the fraction of inspired oxygen. So now in this atmosphere, I have oxygen. This atmosphere has so many gases. It's got nitrogen, it's got carbon dioxide, there may be some amount of hydrogen, and there is also oxygen. So if you take one box, let's say you take one box which is let's say 10 centimeter into 10 centimeter box, if you take all the air within that box, and if you calculate, split it up and calculate what is the percentage of oxygen molecules within that, you will find that if there are 100 molecules, 20 are oxygen. That's what we say by oxygen in the air. So the fraction of inspired oxygen, the oxygen that we take, or the air that we inhale, has got 20% oxygen. That is the meaning of FiO2. Now this differs when we administer oxygen through various means, like the nasal cannula. When you administer oxygen through the nasal cannula, you set at a particular flow rate. So if you are setting it at 1 liter per minute, the percentage of oxygen is 24% of oxygen. When you set it at 2 liters per minute, it increases by 4%, it is 28 liters per minute. Again, you increase it to 3 liters, it is 32% per minute. So 32%. So it keeps increasing for every 4% for every liter of oxygen that you increase. That is for nasal cannula. But for a face mask, it is different, because we also have the flow of air from the sides through the holes which are present in the mask. So when you set a flow rate of 5 to 6 liters through a face mask, the patient gets about 40% FiO2. When you set it at 6 to 7 liter, patient gets 50% of FiO2. When you set it like 6 to 7 liters, patient gets 60%. That is the percentage of FiO2 when you are administering through face mask. But if you are administering through the reservoir bagger, it's very easy to remember. If it is 4 liters per minute, patient gets 40%. If it is 5 liters per minute, patient gets 50%. If it is 6 liters per minute, patient gets 60%. 7 liters, 70%, and so on. That's how we calculate FiO2.
Madam, there's a question. If the pneumonia patient has the O2 saturation already,
Has
so the pneumonia patient has O2 saturation
okay.
already. So what is the difference between him and the COVID-19 patient?
Okay. The difference between a COVID-19 patient and a pneumonia patient is not much. Patient with COVID-19 also has pneumonia. Patient with COVID-19 also has ARDS. Also has ARDS. The disease process is because of the nature of the virus.
Ma'am, for ventilated COVID-19 patients, can we open suction? Can we have open suction? Dr. Punita, if you can answer, because hers, I think, is an internet problem.
Into the atmosphere, not only into the atmosphere, into all.
Unmute.
Dr. Sheila, we can't hear.
I'm sorry.
Say it again. Say it again.
So open suctioning is completely not recommended in a patient with COVID-19. When there is open suctioning, there is an aerosol generation that happens, and because of the aerosol generation, you are just depositing a lot of viruses on the ET tube, on the area surrounding the ET tube, the face of the patient, the linen of the patient, the nurse who is doing the suctioning, everywhere viruses can be deposited because of the aerosol generating activity. Open suctioning is not recommended.
Issue. So whether generally saying the asthma patient is also corona, they have corona.
Many of these patients who have respiratory problems will need care specific to their respiratory problem. Like we'll have to first see whether the patient is having respiratory failure 1 or respiratory failure 2. So patients with COPD and all of that, we'll have to check whether they are having hypoxemia or hypercapnia. So we look at the PaO2. If the PaO2 is less than 60 mm of Hg, but their PaCO2 is normal, that is 35 to 45, then we say they have respiratory failure 1, that is they are having only hypoxemia. But if their PaCO2 is more than 45 mm of Hg, and if their pH, at that time we have to look at the pH, if their pH is less than 7.35, then we know that this patient is hypercapnic, this patient is having type 2 respiratory failure. And the modalities of treatment for these two groups of patients differ based on what kind of respiratory failure they have. Patients with COPD, patients with bronchospasm, patients with pneumonia, all of that based on the respiratory failure characteristics they are treated.
Thank you, ma'am. One of the participants has asked, when you see COVID-19 patient through an X-ray and the tuberculosis, they look same. So how do we differentiate between COVID-19 and tuberculosis patient?
Okay, there are bilateral opacities on both, but I am not an expert on X-rays. I would want to tell you that. So there are many articles which give expert opinion regarding the X-ray of patients, and it is good for us to refer to that. These patients with COVID-19 basically have ground glass appearance because of the epithelial involvement in the lungs. That is the typical chest bilateral opacities which are present. They have bilateral on both sides. Tuberculosis may be unilateral. COVID-19, they will have bilateral chest opacities, whereas in tuberculosis, it may be unilateral. I'm not, there are still more expert opinion that can be obtained on that.
Man, what do you mean by aerosol generation? Can you please explain?
Okay, so aerosol is a fluid-filled substance along with air. So aerosol is a combination of fluid, suspended air particle, a suspended fluid particle. So that is what we mean by aerosol generation. So where does the aerosol come from? It is all from the oral cavity, the nasal cavity, the eyes of the patient. These are the open areas that we have, and oral cavity mainly because these patients have cough. When they cough, there is aerosol generation. There is sputum, the secretions come out. These aerosols contain viruses, and that is the reason we are worried about aerosol generation activities.
Ma'am, why should we avoid ambu bag while intubation?
Okay, when the ambu bag is being used, we know that this is, whenever we use the ambu bag, the aerosols can get into the ambu bag and you cannot use that again. That is the main reason why ambu bags cannot be used. And
why to use prone position in severe cases?
Okay, when a patient is having COVID-19, I told you already, it is a heterogeneous ARDS lung. So there are some alveoli which are normal. There are some alveoli which are fluid filled, within which there are viruses. There are some alveoli which are hyperdistended. There are some alveoli which are almost going to collapse now. So it's a heterogeneous lung. All the alveoli are not similar in a patient with ARDS. Now, when you put the patient on prone, you are able to get a almost homogeneous, because many of the secretions will actually drain down, and there is a, when the normal mechanism, whenever there is fluid and air inside a container, suppose it's a closed container, you turn it around, what happens? The fluid goes down and the air comes up, right? So this is a mechanism whereby the alveoli which is available for gas exchange is recruited. That means we make more alveoli available for gas exchange. This is a maneuver for recruitment of the alveoli, and the pressure that is given during mechanical ventilation when the patient is on prone is a good way by which recruitment of the alveoli can be done. It also decreases the strain on the lungs. I already explained to you about stress and strain. What is stress? The pressure from the mechanical ventilator that is placed on the alveoli is the stress. When the patient is on prone position, the stress is decreased, and the strain is the change in the structure of the alveoli because of the pressure. That strain is also decreased when the patient is put on prone position. We are also able to have a sustained inflation of the alveoli when the
Ma'am, this is muted again.
Oh, sorry. Did you hear me, or should I repeat the entire answer?
Not the entire, it's the last one.
Okay. During prone position, we can give sustained inflation to the patient. Of the sustained inflation of alveoli can be done, and that is one of the reasons why prone position is encouraged in patients with COVID-19. Patients, depending on their clinical stage, each patient is unique. Their clinical problem is unique. Their comorbidities are unique. Their disease status is different. A smoker has a different lung status compared to a non-smoker. A COPD patient has a different status compared to a non-COPD patient. Depending on the patient's status, the hours of prone can be modified, but most COVID-19 patients will require 12 to 16 hours of prone positioning, and very sick patients may be left on prone positioning for even 20 hours.
Ma'am, there's one more question that on WhatsApp nowadays are videos that shows one ventilator can be used for up to 7 to 8 patients. What is your opinion?
I am very sorry. I am not an expert on that, and I'm not able to, in the sense, that is something which we have not done here, and I am not familiar with that, and I do not want to give an opinion which may not be valid.
I think there are many questions. Now we can, President, would you like to say something? Because I think we can make it FAQ. Because there are 500 questions, we are not able to answer so many, sir.
You know, it's a very good, I think we had more question and answer session compared to the many other webinars, I think, in our series. It's very good. I think participants have taken a lot of, they have taken the interest in for attending this webinar. And I'm asking a very simple question, whether in CMC Vellore, do we have any patients in a ventilator with COVID-19?
Yes, sir, but actual details I will be from the administration.
No, I'm not asking. No, I'm not asking the details. Do you have any right now in your ICU? How many you must have CMC must have dedicated to the COVID-19 ICU, and what percentage of patients have been discharged, or any mortality is there in that? Just to know that how CMC Vellore has taken care of these COVID-19 patients in this pandemic season.
Sir, all the details pertaining to my institution, because it's a huge institution, all the details pertaining to my institution at present, I do not have. Maybe Punita ma'am may be able to get that. And
no, I would say I'm not very sure today, but I heard they have a separate ICU dedicated, which is, I think they have around 10 or 12 beds separately for that ICU. And they had one patient, that was a mortality. That was one patient with in the ICU who died. Am I right? That is what I heard. After that, I do not know whether anyone from yesterday, today, and all that.
Yes, ma'am. We have about 22 beds which are completely ICU beds, ICU and MHDU, which are designated as COVID care, and all the nurses in this COVID ICU care wear the full complement of PPE, and they follow all the complete IPC regulations while taking care of the patient. There was one patient whom, as you said, had mortality from COVID-19 in this ICU, and there are patients now who have COVID-19.
How many patients are there within the ICU with COVID-19?
Sir, I've been on leave these few days.
Okay.
But
Okay.
Yeah, that's what she was.
Okay. Anyway, very good. We can close it.
I have one.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
No, I
Punita.
just want to add just 1 or 2 points in relation to some of the questions. When people asked about this TB and corona differences, it is not only based on the X-rays. We know the confirmative diagnosis very specific to TB, bacilli, and also we know about the corona confirmatory test. So if there are different, we need to differentiate between differential diagnosis. We have confirmative tests, so we don't have to depend only on X-rays. So that is one thing I wanted to add. The second point that I wanted to add is, see, this asthma and corona cannot be same. Asthma is a high risk for corona, and to deal with asthma patients, it is a challenge because of their respiratory reserve. What they have is different from normal patients. So that is another thing. And final thing I wanted to say is that this the patients who die in ICU, it is reported 40% of the deaths are due to shock. So that's what is the main observation that has been found. So the patients who come to, although the number is only 6% who really become critically ill, but 40% of them actually die of shock. That's all.
But Dr. Punita, you can just make some explain about the in our nurse practitioner critical care. Generally, we have made our nurse practitioners to be competent enough to handle the ventilators and all. In that perspective, you can give some explanation.
Okay, I think Sheila did mention that some of those procedures, what the medical people are doing now, intensivists only are doing, the practitioners are trained as per the institutional protocols, particularly right now none of our nurses do an intubation at the ICU, but when they are trained and privileged to do, they will be able to do intubation, and they have quite a number of the other procedures like arterial line starting, maintaining, and also starting the ventilators, setting of ventilators, and monitoring, weaning of, deciding when to wean the ventilator in consultation with the team. These are some of the things that these people, the nurse interventions that they can do, which they are not doing. So that is there in their protocol, and it has to be privileged by the institution as per the institutional protocol. So now whatever the nurses who are not able to do, they will be able to do. So whatever ventilator care they have learned, they would be able to do with the patients with COVID also, knowing the latest infection prevention protocols.
But at least now, at least your CMC institutional protocol, at least in CMC institutional protocol, even your nurses have been trained, and which are the protocols which out of this ventilator management has been already delegated to our nurses working in ICU in CMC?
They don't do intubation. Sheila, can you say what's right now?
So we have different ICUs, and the preference is based on the HOD of that ICU. As you are very well aware, they play a major role in what a nurse can do and what a nurse cannot do. We have a critical care CME every year in which both the doctors and nurses together participate. And recently, for the past 3 years, we have had stations, workstations on airway management alone, starting from intubation, setting up of a ventilator, the troubleshooting of a ventilator, and extubation of a patient, in which all the nurses are trained, and they have the clinical competencies on that. This is the nurses who attend the critical care CME. And there is one ICU in which the nurses are privileged to do endotracheal intubation, and even in the emergency, the nurses are privileged to do endotracheal intubation in the absence of a physician, in the absence of an intensivist.
So which are some privileges allowed in the CMC value? The other privileges are setting up of a ventilator can be done by a nurse, troubleshooting of a ventilator can be done by a nurse, and extubation also can be done. The privileging is done, sir, can be done by the nurse. But they do have their critical care technician course, which is a BSc course, and all the students are posted in the ICUs, and they have this as a requirement. So they are there when the extubation takes place, and they do the extubation procedure, and the nurses are privileged for it, and those who are trained and who have competency, they do that. In one of the ICUs, the nurses entirely manage the ventilator as well as the extubation procedure. Okay. Dr. Punita, you had an experience of visiting our nurse practitioners, some sort of, the one or two, we are calling 2 or 3 institutions are doing very well in nurse practitioner critical care program. I think any feedback you might have got it, to what extent these 2 institutions are allowing for the nurses to do some of the procedures?
See, I think MGM Mumbai I visited. There, the nurse practitioner students have been trained, and the intensivists supported so much of their learning process, particularly in the one anesthetist, along with the anesthetist also. So even in the theater, all the intubations they have, many of the intubations they have given to them. And when we deliberated with the practitioners, they said that all of us are trained to intubate, and now we are confident to do intubation. That is one thing. And even arterial line starting has been taught to them how to do that, and they also said they are confident to do arterial line starting. And ventilator, all what Sheila said in relation to settings, connecting, preparing, connecting, setting various settings, and then deciding on even weaning, various weaning protocols, and they make the decision. And also they also, along with the intensivists, they get involved in identifying the admission, whether they really require admissions. So they make a decision. These people are helped to make a decision how to admit them and when they can be discharged or transferred to HDO. They are given quite a lot of training in terms of that. But now after this, when they are, one group finished, but I'm not very sure they are in their orientation process. So probably once they are privileged again in that particular institution, they will be able to do. But these 2 institutions, one institution that I went, they have been very, very positive in training this group of people, and they said we can depend on them so well, and we would like them to come back to our ICU and take charge, and they will be able to do as like our those who are studying PG students, they will be able to, one of them to help with them in their team to run the ICUs.
Which means that critical care program, the objective of which we started, at least in India itself, in the institutions, at least some institutions, they have accepted our nurses to do these procedures. That's a good development. It's a positive development to expand this program to the other institutions. That the learning we take out of this, the nurse practitioner program, where today's session on ventilate. So people might be, at least know, the participants who are attending, they should be able to make a judgment. Yes, nurses will be allowed if they undergo a nurse practitioner critical program. They will be privileged to do the procedures, which already CMC is doing, and in the other institutions also will be allowed to do these procedures. So that is empowering the nurses for to work in these ICUs. Anyway, thank you very much. So we'll close the webinar.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Dr. Thank you very much. I'll tell you, sir.
Punita, you want to make 1 minute? Punita, want to make any remarks? Sheila, want to make any remarks?
No, sir. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Okay. Dr. Punita, you want to make any remark?
No, sir. Thank you.
Secretary Sarojit, you want to make any remark?
No, sir. It is very well conducted.
Okay. Yes, last.
Thank you very much, all of you. Yeah, thank you very much, all of you, including the participants, for attending our webinar. And we look forward for the same interest from the participants for tomorrow also. It is on mental health considerations. So I believe this is very much important subject during the COVID-19 outbreak. So I request everybody to attend tomorrow at 11 a.m. So we'll come back to you tomorrow at 11 a.m. And the video of today's session will be there in the late evening on the INC website. So participants who could not attend from the beginning can also view through that INC website. So thank you very much. Namaste. See you tomorrow at 11 a.m. Thank you.